Well, I am primarily talking about aquaculture nutrition here. I also think it's quite important to cover some other related issues. And one of them, which is very important in today's industry, is sustainability. But I really wanted to highlight this from the perspective of sustainability. Now, sustainability, especially in aquaculture, means something different to almost every single person. And so by preparing the videos in this series on sustainability, I really wanted to expand our understanding that sustainability of aquaculture is much more than just replacing marine ingredients in feeds for fish. That everything that we do with our aquaculture, whether it's the way we use our water, whether it's the way we manage our ponds, whether we manage our water, where we source our feed ingredients from, all has an impact on the water footprint of aquaculture. And so in this video that I'm going to be sharing, this presentation I'm going to be sharing with you today, I'm going to be talking about one aspect of sustainability. So we normally think about sustainability in relation to sustainability of feed, but sustainability, of course, is also sustainability of the environment. And I'm going to talk today particularly about water footprint. Now, we don't necessarily use water. We borrow water from the public commons, water that come out of reservoirs, out of lakes. Uh, in some cases, it could be in a pond. But in general, we fill the ponds even from public waterways. And so when we use this water, then there were consequences in terms of oxygen depletion, effluents from feed, maybe changes in levels of soluble nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. And so then we have to consider all of this because in the end, this water has to be returned for use by other people for other purposes. And we need to be good neighbors. We need to make sure that our water is clean and no one gets upset with us. And of course, if we take good care of water, that also benefits us because then we reduce our risk of disease. We improve our own pond performance, our own performance in the cages, in the rivers, and so on. And so I wanted to talk in particular about water footprint. Now, this video is divided into two parts. The first part is going to be looking more at some of the generalities of water, in particular salinity, which is one of the key factors that decides what species can be grown where, whether inland or in the sea. And I'm going to explain a little bit about how that makes fish physiology different. And then we're going to have part two, where in part two, we then begin to look at specific aspects of farming. That is our water footprint that we use to farm and our consequences on water footprint, looking at the whole ecological prospect of aquaculture. And in a lot of cases, our water footprint is not local, it's far away. For example, a water footprint is far away when we're talking about buying feed ingredients from Brazil, Argentina, wherever, and those feed ingredients have a water footprint, and processing of those ingredients has a water footprint. And so those are far removed from the location of the farm itself, but they have to be included in the entire impact of the water footprint. So here we go. Aquaculture's Water Footprint, Part 1. First of all, I want to look at the world's water footprint. And a water footprint has generally three measures. One, green water. So this is rainwater stored in soils and plants and forests and jungles and so on. And it also includes any collected rainfall in those forests. Now, when the soils and forests become saturated with water, then of course we have runoff, and runoff then goes into the rivers. And then that's the next category, blue water. So water sourced from the surface, like the rivers, lakes, and of course oceans, or groundwater resources, which is water that's being taken from the water table. And then we have a third category, which is gray water. Now, gray water is not polluted water per se, but most places we have limited amount of pollutants in the water. We have governments setting limits for maximum phosphorus, maximum nitrogen, maximum suspended solids, maximum BOD, maximum COD, and so on. And so gray water is actually the water that we need to dilute those pollutants down to meet specific water quality standards set by the authorities. So if we look at this graphic, we see here that most of the water is in fact seawater. And we have just a little bit of freshwater, readily available freshwater here. And then we have freshwater stored in ice caps and so on. This one may be brackish water, it's not identified. If we look up in here, we can see that we have the countries of the world, and darker is greater use of water than the light color. And one of the things that I wanted to point out here, and we'll talk about it again in a minute, is that the global average water footprint is around 1,240 cubic meters per person per year. Now, I'm going to show a graph from this document, which was a conference held here in Bangkok that I was able to attend back in 2010. And the graph that I want to show you is this one. So it's talking about the total and per capita freshwater availability in the different continents. So we see here in black we have total availability, and in white we have per capita availability. And we see that in fact Asia has the largest quantity of freshwater available in totality. But because of our high population density, whether we're talking about India, whether we're talking about China and so on, and the population in most of the Asian countries is quite high, that on a per capita basis, we actually have very limited access to water. Now, this is actually, looking at the units, this is cubic kilometers per year. So this in fact is a huge amount of water. We then look, for example, at Australia and Oceania. We have very small amount of water, but because we have such low populations, the per capita availability is actually very high. So if we compare this 3.92, which I believe is per capita here, as you can see, this is cubic meters per year per capita, that while the average is 1,240, that in Asia it's only less than 4. So we have very limited access to fresh water. Now, some of the characteristics about water that are very important, I'm going to raise a few of them. First of all, we have to talk about salinity, because salinity determines where we're going to be farming, which species we can use. And it's a very important consideration. So I have a favorite AI. It's called Perplexity AI. And I asked it, what salinity was, and this is what it answered. Salinity refers to the concentration of dissolved salts in water, primarily sodium chloride, but also includes other minerals such as magnesium and calcium. It is a critical parameter for understanding water quality and aquatic ecosystems, and aquaculture definitely is involved with aquatic ecosystems. So when we're talking about the measurement of salinity, we're generally using electrical conductivity and so on. We're measuring the concentrations of ions, and we can use things like ion-specific electrodes to single out specific ions. And then we can measure the sum of all of these ions in the water. And we typically refer to them as parts per thousand, or 1 in 1,000 units, because we're actually dealing with grams of salt per kilogram of water, where when we talk about percent, it's parts per 100. So moving on, fresh water generally has a salinity of less than 0.5 ppt. Seawater averages around 35 ppt, but we have another couple of categories here. We have brackish water. So brackish water can be anywhere between the freshwater salinity and the seawater salinity. Brackish water is in estuaries, river mouths, swampy shoreside areas, mangrove forests, all of these kinds of places where you have freshwater runoff and you have areas where tides are moving in and out, and you have this mixing of the two different types of water. And even in one location, depending on the movement of the tides and the rainfall or so on, you can have considerable swings in the salinity level of brackish water. And then we have brine. So brine, we mostly know, is salinity very high, above 50 ppt. In aquaculture, we're familiar with the brine shrimp, or Artemia, which were originally collected from the wild from a number of high saline lakes in various places in the world. And then probably the highest salinity location that people probably are familiar with is the Dead Sea in Israel, where if a person lays on top of the water, it's impossible for them to sink because of the high density and the high salinity of the water. So looking over here, on the right-hand side, we see this graphic that I got from Wikipedia where it shows you the range of salinities. So we see here at the bottom, drinking water salinity is less than 0.1 ppt. If salinity is higher than that, people can taste it and they don't like it much. We then have irrigation, which is generally limited to 2 ppt or lower because most freshwater plants have difficulties absorbing water from soils if the soil is too salty. The osmotic gradient is working against them. We then have the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, and these are lower than typical seawater because they are bodies of water that have a lot of freshwater inflows, but they have very narrow mouths going out into the open ocean, which would allow for seawater to come in and raise the salinity level in the water. So we have our average seawater. Then we have Mediterranean. So Mediterranean, once again, we have a very large body of water. We have a narrow mouth at the Straits of Gibraltar. But in the case of the Mediterranean, we have very little fresh water coming in relative to the size of the saline body of water. Primarily, we have the Nile River is the main one that I can think of. And so that's a situation where the salinity due to evaporation is above 35, but there's no fresh water coming in to dilute it, and there's no big quantity of seawater coming in from the Atlantic Ocean that would help to lower it down as well. And then finally we have the Red Sea. So the Red Sea is 40 ppt, and of course it's in a hot, basically tropical temperature, but it's in an area where it's surrounded by desert, and so you have evaporation. You also then have narrow strait down between, I believe it's Eritrea and Yemen, and so water coming in once again is constricted. You have evaporation and you have no water running off the land, so that raises the salinity above the typical seawater. Now, I looked at the mineral composition of seawater. This is from Stanford University, and we see that the two biggest ones, of course, are chloride and sodium. And then we have all of the other minerals in this table decreasing as the concentrations go down and down. The ones we're most interested in are nitrogen, different forms here. We have nitrite, nitrate, ammonia, and organic nitrogen. And then the other one we're concerned about a lot in aquaculture is phosphorus. So we have here phosphorus as organic phosphorus, and we have phosphorus as inorganic phosphate. Now, in this book called Seawater, Its Composition, Properties, and Behavior, I found this quotation that I want to share with you. The concentrations of the major dissolved ions can vary from place to place in the oceans, but their relative proportions remain virtually constant. So the thing is that the composition of the water does not change, although the total quantity, or in other words, total quantity as measured as salinity, varies from location to location. So we have this very interesting map developed by this Danish cartographer called the Spillhouse projection. And if we look at this, we see here we've got Antarctic in the center, and then we have all of the sea water bodies all shown together in this one map. So we have the Red Sea, we have the Mediterranean, we have the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, and so on. And then we also can look at this one, and sorry, just a second, do that again. We also have this, which is the same projection, but it's showing now ocean currents. And so we see around Antarctic, we have cold water currents. In the Arctic, we have around Greenland, we have cold water currents. And then in the southern oceans, going up into the northern oceans, we see these warm water currents. And so this then causes mixing of all of the oceanic water, giving us a consistent elemental profile as measured by salinity. But due to the various constrictions in various places, as we discussed earlier with some of these inland seas, the salinity can be higher or lower than the average. Now, moving to freshwater, here we have a list of different salinities of rainwater inland and near the coast, a lake, freshwater lakes with a large drainage basin, and a number of rivers, St. Lawrence River in Canada, Rhine River, Germany, Murray River in Australia. Murray River is about as I understand it, is the fifth longest river on Earth, but it moves through Australia through largely desertified areas, so it has very little fresh water coming into it, but it has evaporation across the Australian desert. And then we have the Colorado River, which flows through a number of different geographies, but it has very little water coming in and a lot of water being removed for irrigation from the middle of the river down to the mouth in the Gulf of Mexico. And so we have then a very high salinity there. Now, we talked about the fact that when we measure salinity, we talk about parts per thousand. So while this table is showing us here, for example, that the blood of animals is 7 to 12,000 ppm, let's think about it in terms of 7 to 12 ppt. And then we have seawater here at 35 ppt. So water provides numerous nutrients, of course, but I want to focus on the minerals. So we have macro minerals and we have trace minerals. Now, most aquatic animals, whether we're talking about at least the fish and also crustaceans, we have direct excretion of ammonia from the gills, and we have absorption of sodium and chloride ions to manage the osmolality of the blood, to manage the osmoregulation. We have limited uptake of minerals via healthy skin, and that applies to both fish and amphibians like frogs. But if the skin is injured in any way, parasites or wounds or whatever, then of course this can be a very dangerous situation, because then the animal cannot really control its blood osmolality. We know that almost all animals living in water have to consume water while they're feeding. Whether they want the water or not, they're going to get it. Small organisms may absorb inorganic elements from water and soils, and they convert it into various organic forms incorporated into their tissues. And of course, then these organic minerals move from the bottom up through to the top levels of the food chain. Young fish that are only eating microbial sources such as microalgae, bacteria, yeast, and zooplankton. This is where they obtain a small amount of minerals, but they also obtain quite a lot from the water itself. And then, of course, larger animals, whether omnivores or carnivores, obtain most of their minerals when they consume prey. And we also know that bottom-feeding species such as carp are known to obtain phosphorus and presumably other minerals from consumption of pond soils. And I might include detritivores in this category as well, whether it's incidental consumption of mud or whatever. Now, we talked about salinity. Well, how are the animals living in these environments? How are they managing it? Well, we have to talk about osmoregulation, which is the ability of the fish to regulate the salinity inside the body with the salinity outside the body. So, looking first at marine fish. Okay, a rainbow trout's not a marine fish, but I wanted a fish that I could use to illustrate this topic. Marine fish are hyporegulators. What does that mean? Well, fish will dehydrate if they cannot keep the water in the body. Why? Because the blood is 9 ppt, but the seawater is 35, and the osmotic gradient wants to move water from inside to outside. So they risk dehydration, so they have to drink continuously. They have to prevent water escaping out through the skin. They have to absorb electrolytes and in such a way that they can keep the water in. They excrete very concentrated urine to keep the water in, and typically excrete fairly concentrated salts. Whereas when we look at a freshwater fish are hyperregulators. In this case, the blood, once again, is 9 ppt, but the freshwater is only 0.5, so the osmotic gradient is moving in the opposite direction, and the water, the ions want to come out of the water and go into the blood. So in this case, when you consider that the fish has a skin which is typically impervious to water, fish will swell if they can't keep the water out. So unlike a marine fish, a freshwater fish does not drink. It only takes in water incidental with its feeding. It wants to prevent water uptake through the skin. We see it's dilute urine, excreting all the time, meaning it's trying to get the water out as much as possible. But once again, it tries to retain the ions, and we have limited excretion from food. So water as a source of oxygen. So, of course, extremely important for us in aquaculture. So oxygen transfer into water occurs slowly at the air-water interface, and without aeration, creating water movement, oxygen diffusion from surface to bottom is extremely slow. And as oxygen saturation decreases, then here I have an example from shrimp, that shrimp find it increasingly difficult to obtain enough oxygen, because without aeration, the shrimp located typically at the bottom of the pond are going to be in the part of the pond where the water has the least concentration of oxygen. So this is a graph from Penaeus monodon, and it's showing you oxygen saturation at 30 degrees, 25 degrees, and 20 degrees, and showing you that oxygen consumption goes down quite quickly once the oxygen level drops below about 4.3 ppm. Okay, we're not talking here about parts per thousand, but when we look at this, we see these three X's. These X's are the location where the shrimp comes to the surface because it's desperate to find enough oxygen. And the reason for this is because as the oxygen concentration in the water goes down, the partial pressure of the oxygen in the water goes down, oxygen molecules become harder and harder to find. So this is one graph that I like very much to explain what's going on here. So as I said, water has a low partial pressure of oxygen, 7 ppm, or approximately 0.0007%, unlike atmospheric oxygen, which is about 21% oxygen. And I generally recommend that we measure oxygen as percent saturation rather than as ppm, as 100% saturation changes with temperature. And I have over here this nomograph showing you at the different temperatures of 20, 25, and 30 that as the water temperature goes up, the oxygen level in the water at 100% saturation actually goes down. Now, if aquatic animals are unable to obtain sufficient oxygen, which is a very common problem in aquaculture, many metabolic processes are inhibited. So feed intake declines and digestion is impaired. Now, the animal doesn't have enough oxygen, and so it loses its desire to eat, to protect itself. And of course, if feed intake goes down, digestion goes down, growth is reduced, stress increases, and antioxidant defense declines, and immune response is impaired. One key thing to keep in mind here is that both for fish and crustaceans, that the same hormones that control osmoregulation also control growth and also control the stress response and immune response. So if these hormones are busy in one area, they tend to ignore what's going on in other areas. And then, as we know, animals will migrate from low oxygen to high oxygen environments to avoid metabolic depression, caused by oxygen starvation. Now, that's fine unless we're talking about animals in cages. And so if we have high density inside of a cage and we have a low oxygen water environment, then the animals have really no need to escape. And so this, of course, causes lots of problems. So moving on to a different area, we have looking at water and some of its physical characteristics. Water, of course, is dense with a density of 1, a standardized density of 1. And fish have swim bladders that they can use to adjust their buoyancy to move up and down in the water. So we see here a picture of a fish with a swim bladder in the upper part of the body cavity. And what happens here is that the ions move from the blood, the gases move from the blood So one of the properties of water, of course, is it has quite dense. It has a density of 1, standardized density. And that fish have swim bladders so that they can adjust their buoyancy up and down and move up and down in the water. And so in this photograph, we see here the swim bladder is located typically in the upper part of the body cavity up near the backbone. And gases move from the blood into the sac and increase the pressure and the volume, and then the animal will rise. And if the animal wants to sink, then the nervous system basically directs the blood to absorb gases from the sac, and the volume of the sac will decrease and the animal will descend. The key thing here is that because the fish are basically swimming in a high dense environment, the water is actually holding them up. And so they don't have to fight against gravity, and the skeletal structures are lightweight. And consequently, they do not have a need for heavy calcified bones. And so in fish, collagen and soft bones predominate. And from a nutritional point of view, we look at it and we say, well, actually, the body burden, the body volume of quantities of calcium and phosphorus are lower than in terrestrial animals because they don't need it for their bones. Now, locomotion. I am very curious about all of this. One, water does not compress. And we notice that most fish species have a torpedo shape and appear to move through water almost effortlessly. And because of that, we actually can see some differences between fish that move. Pelagic fish like tuna and mackerel have a lot of red muscle, which is highly active swimming muscle, versus most fish, especially in freshwater zones, that have mostly white muscle, which is low energy muscle. Okay, so fish use their body and gill movements to create cavities, and these create these low pressure spiral vortices in the water, and you can see what's going on down here in this graphic. And then when they create these low pressure cavities, the water moves in to fill those cavities and pushes the fish forward. So the fish doesn't actually have to spend very much energy to swim at all. There's a lot of interesting papers about this. And I may talk about this later because it has a direct impact on energy requirements of fish. Probably one of the most amazing sights we will ever see is where we have fish like salmon migrating up a river, coming to a waterfall or a rapids, and being able to jump step by step from the bottom to the top in very, very fast water. And even today, there's a lot of mystery about how exactly they're able to do this. But they're able to absorb energy from the water. It's very, very interesting to see this in real life. So to summarize, our planet has a lot of free water. Most of it is in the oceans. And freshwater resources are limited, especially on a per capita basis here in Asia where we have huge populations. Now, that of course is going to limit our ability to expand our aquaculture, and I will be talking about that in part 2. Water, as we know, has these unique chemical and physical characteristics that aquatic animals utilize in their physiology and metabolism: source of oxygen, the density of the water, dissolved minerals that they can use for their nutritional requirements. So I really want to state that we do certainly need more research on minerals. And in the past, many fish nutrition researchers overlooked the importance of dietary mineral requirements of aquatic animals because they assumed that most aquatic animals would obtain some or all of their trace mineral requirements from the water, and therefore we didn't need to really worry about whether we provided that to them in the feed or not. In fact, doing research on mineral requirements of fish and crustaceans is very difficult because it's very hard for us to distinguish which is coming from the water and which is coming from the feed. But nevertheless, this is something that we do need to do because we're beginning to realize that with our more recent molecular biology technologies, we now know that many mineral elements, whether we're talking about selenium, zinc, iron, copper, they directly influence gene expression. And we do need to know in much greater detail where these minerals elements are doing their job, especially in things like antioxidant enzymes. And we really need to find a way to get this research done to determine the mineral requirements of many more species than we have today. So this is a picture of a gilthead sea bream farm that I visited in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Sardinia. And you can see here that the cage is totally submerged in the foreground. You have an outer ring which is kind of holding up the cage. You have an inner ring which is representing the area where the feed is going to be distributed. And in the background we see cages that actually have rails above, and that's simply for the purposes of allowing humans, especially divers, to be able to have place to stand and move in order to be able to go in and do the cleaning, removing mortalities, and so on. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video. Okay, well, I hope you found this video informative. I know it's a bit general. Maybe many of you know most of this. Uh, so if you have enjoyed this video, please like and share it. Please subscribe to the channel because I have a lot more interesting content focusing for nutrition and also sustainability. There's not a lot of material out there on aquaculture, and I intend to make videos so that this becomes a place where you can come and find a lot more interesting things.